Hello and welcome back. Now that you're here, we can go through the play-by-play of the climax of Jujutsu Kaisen's final arc, and then go through my thoughts and review of the chapter. So without any further delay, let's get into it. The chapter begins with a 1-month flashback to Yuta and Gojo switch training, where Yuta asks Gojo to eat Sukuna's last finger in order to copy the shrine technique as we see him use in their first battle. Gojo declines Yuta's request, saying that just one finger isn't enough data to analyze Sukuna's shrine technique. Yuta confirms this by saying he was only able to use cursed speech effectively due to Inumaki's guidance. Gojo goes on to say that losing their connection to Sukuna would be a bad idea since they could potentially use it against him in the coming battle, claiming that he'd prefer to be like Hikari and gamble on keeping the finger instead. This prompts Gojo to explain how Yuta could still manage to copy the shrine technique, but meanwhile we get a deeper explanation of the copy technique and its mechanics. We gain direct confirmation that Rika does have to ingest a portion of the target's body, which many of us already surmised. However, there is still new information. For example, we learn that the technique Yuta is trying to copy requires a more vital body part or more body parts depending on the strength of the technique. We also learn that the number of times Yuta can copy a technique directly stems from the type and number of body parts ingested as well. Yuta is still able to use a technique without a vital body part so long as he enters a binding vow to limit how many times he can use said copied technique. Additionally, if the body parts ingested have been restored in any way, such as reverse curse technique, it will disable the use of the copied technique. We now know that Hana and Inumaki aren't healable by Jujutsu nor modern medicine, thus explaining why only some characters are able to regrow limbs off screen and why Yuta wasn't able to copy Hikari or Gojo effectively, aside from requiring the 6 eyes in the latter case. The sorcerers plan on keeping Yuji as in the dark as possible due to his resonance with Sukuna, but just before the battle, Gojo with the 6 eyes confirms that Yuji is already engraved with Sukuna's technique. And so Yuta is able to copy Yuji's shrine technique for use against Sukuna by having Rika eat his ring finger. The implications of this are made all too clear as Sukuna and the audience realize at the same time that they still have access to Sukuna's final finger. Back at the dam, Gakuganji and Utahime consider that even though Sukuna's fingers are immune to all damage, they still may allow for techniques to affect and pass through them with a proper binding vow. We then learn that just in the last 20 minutes or so, Kugisaki Nobara has awoken from her coma, and she excitedly uses the straw doll technique to establish a connection to Sukuna through resonance, allowing her to impale him with nails from over 100 miles away. This heavily damages Sukuna just as he performed his risky technique recovery and attempted to cast a domain expansion, leaving him unable to protect himself from Yuji's sure hit effect. Yuji recognizes Nobara's handiwork and smiles earnestly as his domain begins to cut away at Sukuna's soul. Yuji seizes the opportunity to close in and batter Sukuna as they engage in a brief back and forth as Sukuna announces that the battle isn't over, claiming that Yuji's domain isn't nearly refined enough to strip him of his scales. He then states that Yuji hasn't been using reverse curse technique for a while now, and with the large expenditure of cursed energy that a domain expansion entails, Yuji has been pushed too far past his limit, and that he is actually the one on the verge of death. As they clash with several mutual blows, they both land one final decisive strike, but before Sukuna can make his next attack, he is sent recoiling from the double impact of Yuji's divergent fist technique. And while Sukuna was a moment too late to match Yuji's next move, he vows to end the cycle of curses, readying a vicious final black flash that seems to finally put an end to the King of Curses, as the editor claims that the bell is ringing for this long battle. I believe that this chapter does serve as an effective end to the battle against Sukuna, although I find that it is falling short of expectations in a few key ways, most of which aren't a fault of the chapter itself, but the decisions that led the narrative to this point. For example, the return of Nobara was something that the vast majority of the fans had expected for a long time now. However, it has next to no actual build-up or foreshadowing, and we have no reason to assume that Nobara would be able to deal this kind of damage to Sukuna other than the catch-all excuse of binding vows. I understand that Yuta's technique explanation was held back this long, so it would be more of a plot twist when we learned that Yuta never actually ate Sukuna's finger. But to spend the beginning of a chapter said to be the climax of the entire arc on a basic explanation is a bit of a letdown for me personally. This chapter also continues some of the other long-standing issues with the latter half of this arc. We get no glimpse into what is happening with Maki, Hakari, or Meimei when they are all still able-bodied sorcerers who should be able to assist in this fight. Hakari, of course, is still battling Uraume off-screen, assumably, as they have been for about 30 chapters at this point, essentially wasting their potential to some degree, as Uraume hasn't been in a single fight that properly highlighted her as a character, in my opinion. On the topic of wasted potential, Megumi, who is hyped up to be a prodigy that could surpass Gojo, has only amounted to pulling Sukuna's leg into a puddle for 5 seconds during this fight, and did literally nothing else in this entire chapter besides generally nerfing Sukuna, which wasn't even directly addressed. A lot of these criticisms are assuming that the next 4 chapters won't continue this battle and then resolve Hakari and Uraume's battle in a satisfying way, so I'll shift to speaking on what I did like in order to brighten the tone of this video. I personally enjoyed the realistic power level of Yuji's domain, as it was entirely believable and not overpowered in any way. I know a lot of fans would have liked his domain to have some high concept ability that elevated him to godlike status, but given that he didn't even have an innate technique until halfway through this battle, it wouldn't be realistic for him to have such a refined domain expansion. And what we end up getting was perfect. It was just enough to set Yuji up to win the battle in a way that suits him well. The return of the Divergent Fist was satisfying, and the Black Flash was a perfect way to end this battle. The explanation of the general twist from last chapter with Sukuna's finger was great. It was truly a well-designed mystery, because it felt so believable in hindsight when you consider that Gege had mentioned in previous chapters that he kept forgetting to draw Yuji without his 2 fingers, thus signaling an emphasis on them in long-standing foreshadowing. The explanation of Yuta's techniques have cleared up a number of questions I had about Inumaki's arm and the copy technique in general, so I found that to be an effective use of flashback despite it eating into the climax's runtime. I also really enjoyed the visuals of the chapter, including the 2 companion graphics, and the idea of Nobara and Megumi coming back from the brink of death like Gojo to save Yuji from Sukuna was excellent conceptually, even if I have gripes with its execution. Ultimately, I did enjoy the chapter, and I cannot in good conscience blame the narrative structural issues I have with the overall ending of Jujutsu Kaisen on this one chapter, so I'll still be rating it an 8 out of 10 with the caveat that this rating is given under the assumption that this battle is practically completely over. If this leads to a further climax where Megumi is able to live up to his potential and the plot can convince me that any of the students actually have the potential to surpass Gojo as the story had implied, then this chapter would most likely have a much higher rating. Thanks for watching. I'm on the edge of my seat waiting to see what Gege does in these next few chapters. For now, why not let me know in the comments if you think there will be a Jujutsu Kaisen Part 2, but either way, I hope you stay safe and take it easy.